Hello, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're joining us on YouTube, this is Josh Bertram, your faithful host. Will Wright, our political host, wasn't able to join us today. He was out of town traveling. But we have with us today David Gushee, Dr. David Gushee. Am I saying that right, brother?
You are. Yes, you
Awesome.
are, Josh.
I should have checked before I hit record, man. I'm sorry. But you know what? It adds a kind of human element to the podcast that I think is important, right? So let's see, David. So you are a professor at Union Theological Seminary. You're an ethicist, pastor, author, and advocate. The distinguished university professor of Christian ethics at Mercer University and chair of Christian social ethics at I'm not going to be able to say this, the Free University in Amsterdam. How do you say that? Do you know how to say it? In
Vrij Universiteit.
Vrij Universiteit. That sounded so much better than how I said it.
And that's not good enough, but it's as good as I can do. Yeah.
And you're a senior research fellow at International Baptist Theological Study Center. You've been elected the past president of the American Academy of Religion and Society of Christian Ethics, signaling your role as one of America's leading Christian ethicists. Sorry that I was reading your biography to you, but the way that went, it just felt like it was that was a natural way to do it. So thank you for being on the show with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I really appreciate it. So you have a new book that's coming out that we're going to talk about, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. What an amazing title. Really looking forward to digging into that with you. But kind of tell the audience a little bit about yourself. I mean, we have a really diverse audience, liberal, conservative, Christian, non-Christian, just goes on the gamut from gay to straight, everything. So what kind of tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are writing books about Christian enemies of democracy.
Sure. Thanks for having me on your show. And
Absolutely.
It's good to have a chance to talk about, these issues. So I'm a Christian ethicist. So Christian ethicists try to help Christians live faithfully. I like your title, by the way, Faithful Politics. Trying to follow Jesus faithfully in, all the complexity of life.
Yes.
My training was at William and Mary, and then Southern Baptist Seminary, and then Union Seminary in New York. So both, you might say, moderately conservative and state university, and then the liberal, Protestant environment at Union. I've taught at 3 U.S. Baptist schools, and I'm at Mercer University in Atlanta. And then I have this European posting now too. So it's a joy doing Christian ethics. I've always thought it was such important work, bringing Christian faith to bear on everyday life and how the church engages the world. I've been really interested in politics as far back as high school. But when I got trained in Christian ethics, I was trained in an era a while back in which there was not a sense that U.S. democracy was in crisis. There was a sense that we had a decently functioning democracy. And so what Christian ethicists did was to attempt to speak either to policymakers or to Christians about what policy priorities should be advanced, right? So I've worked on issues like climate, marriage and family, human rights, genocide.
That sounds fascinating.
Stuff like that, right? So I've done various issues, and there was a kind of an approach that was like, okay, so we help to inform the witness of the churches in Washington, and also sometimes to intervene directly on issues like a big one, probably the biggest issue in which I did public advocacy was post 9/11 abuse of prisoners that the U.S. was doing.
Wow.
And so I was a leader in crafting documents and advocacy to try to roll back the Bush-Cheney detainee abuse. So So that was, 15 years ago now, longer.
It's
But
wild, isn't it?
yeah, but since 2019, 20, 21, the the health of American democracy itself has seemed much more fragile.
Yes.
And so this was a book that was motivated fundamentally by two questions. Um, what is happening that is undermining democracy itself in the U.S.? And in the process, I discovered that it was a worldwide issue, not just a U.S. issue.
Yes, I've heard that.
And what are the resources within Christian ethics to defend a certain vision of democratic politics and democratic participation? So that's what the book tries to get at.
That's amazing. So, how do you structure the book in a way that is trying to take us, the reader, where you want us to go? Like, how do you move through the book for like hitting your major topics that you want? Because it's very obviously very intriguing that the Christian enemies. So, like, are we talking about Christian nationalism? Are we talking about just super, like, I mean, KKK people, just white supremacists? Are we talking about on the other? What's going on in the book? How do you walk us through and
Yeah,
define this Christian
let me
enemy?
let me describe the flow.
Yeah.
Um, I I start off by attempting to draw on political science, history, and literature to define democracy,
Hmm.
and to say how it was after a really, really long, various kind of sojourn that democracy was arrived at in the Western world and much of the rest of the world as the preferred political system.
The end
Um,
of history.
right, but why? How that happened? Because I mean, it was a relatively recent development if you think about the whole sweep
Yeah.
of human history. So, what is democracy, and why? Why is it preferable to other existing political systems? So that's where I start, and then I talk about various alternatives and threats to democracy. Um, this is a long discussion going back to the ancient world, but you know, uh, I talk about alternatives and threats to democracy, focusing especially on democratic backsliding. What are the factors that lead to
Hmm.
democracies beginning to unravel? And then I propose a paradigm of what I'm going to call authoritarian reactionary Christianity. This is my preferred term instead of Christian nationalism
Hmm.
because I think it's broader. My proposal is that ever since the birth of modern democracy, um, a significant chunk of Christians have positioned themselves in negative reaction to either democracy as a political system or liberal democracy as a political system plus culture, you might say.
Yes.
Um, um, and that this negative reaction has intensified since the 1960s. And so I use a framework of revolution and counter-revolution to describe what I'm seeing. That
Hmm.
that many Christians think that a secular, anti-Christian cultural revolution has swept the country or maybe a large part of the world, and that these liberalizing trends are a fundamental threat to democracy itself or to Christianity in particular. And so they've settled into a paradigm that I'm calling authoritarian reactionary Christianity,
Wow.
which basically is this posture. The culture is going to hell because traditional Christian values are being set aside.
Right.
Um, uh, Best examples: sexuality, family, uh,
Yes.
right, etc. Um, the democratic system, we've tried to use the democratic process to push back against these liberalizing changes, and we've largely failed.
Mm.
the culture has continued to erode. Now I'm speaking in the perspective of
You're speaking from the perspective
right,
of
right,
of
of
the
the
authoritative,
authoritarian
reactionary,
Christians. Yeah.
authoritarian, reactionary Christians.
Right. Because the democratic process is not pushing back these cultural liberalizing trends, we may need to find another way to accomplish our goals. We might need to work around democracy or manipulate democracy or end democracy to accomplish our fundamental goal of restoring traditional values and the primacy of Christianity in the public square. And this, I think, is part of what January 6th means in the U.S.
Yeah.
But it's also something that has happened in other countries. And so I do 7 country studies, Josh.
Wow.
It begins with France.
France.
From the 19th and early 20th centuries up through the Vichy regime.
Okay.
Germany in the 19th and early 20th century leading up to the rise of Hitler. Christianity in authoritarian reactionary Christianity in Putin's Russia, in Poland, in Viktor Orban's Hungary, in Bolsonaro's Brazil, and in Trump's United States. So I do 7 country studies: France, Germany, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Brazil, and the U.S. And then I move to call on 3 bodies of what I would call a pro-democratic tradition in Christian ethics that we should be calling forth to have a better engagement with modern politics. And those are what I call the Baptist democratic tradition, the Black Christian democratic tradition, and the covenantal tradition. Okay? So that's the flow. With the overall
Pentecostal tradition, huh? They're too tied up in a 7 mountain mandate.
They are. That's right. I don't think the Pentecostal.
I mean, I'm Pentecostal, and I am very concerned.
I don't think it especially helps us, right? Also, the tendency towards apocalyptic thinking,
right?
Apocalyptic, heavily eschatological thinking,
yes.
And I think there's a lack of discipline in the tradition in terms of being seduced by charismatic kind of politicians like Bolsonaro and Trump.
I agree with you. 100%.
Yeah. So here's what democracy is. Here's why it's fragile, but here's why it's better than its alternatives. Here's this authoritarian reactionary Christian tendency that you can see since the 17th century. Here's you see it on steroids in the late 20th and early 21st century. Here's 7 countries where you see it, and here are some resources for pushing back against it. That's the flow of the book.
Beautiful. Beautiful. You know, we have had several people on this podcast. We've talked about Christian nationalism. Number one, I love the way you broaden it, because we feel like Christian nationalism, I'm not one of them. Yeah. You know, and I know a lot of people, I'm not crazy, which they're not. And I don't think Christian nationalists are crazy. I think they're operating from their worldview and their values and what they think. I'm not saying it's correct. I think it's a misinterpretation of Scripture many times, but they're operating from their own worldview, their own way of thinking about the world, and somehow it makes sense to them, whatever it is, even though it may not make sense to everyone else. There's a large chunk of people, and we've had people like the guy who wrote, I think it's Stephen Wolfe. He wrote The Case for Christian Nationalism. Yeah. We had him on the podcast, talk with them. It was amazing hearing the stuff. Like, amazing in the sense that, like, so wait, you're saying that, like, can a Muslim run for office if this is what's happening? And we didn't get the straightest answer to that question. It was kind of yes, but, you know. And I'm like, man, like, but I was in this line of thinking. And sometimes I feel like, sometimes it feels like the grass is greener on the other side. And I know that, like, man, I don't believe in that. And it's fascinating to hear you talk about this. Like, when it comes to, like, let's go to Trump and the United States. and even the Pentecostal, even this Pentecostal tradition, because I'm super interested in this. This is what I grew up in, and I feel like it's the place where I can influence the most, for some rationality and some critical thinking. Um, what role has the Pentecostal church played? You had said they're not helping us, and I would love for you to go in. I don't know if you go into the book, but what role have they played in creating this backlash? Because again, you said Trump has been very supported by these massive charismatic leaders and Pentecostal leaders that said he was the new Cyrus. He's
Right.
predicted, right? How do you address that, or do you?
A little bit, and also in Brazil too, with
Well, yeah, yeah,
Bolsonaro.
yeah.
Um, the broad tendency is a deep dissatisfaction with contemporary pluralism, liberalism, um, religious diversity. Sometimes it's about race too, like immigration, um, and a deep nostalgia for a Christian-dominated politics, and culture. Um, so, make America great again partly meant
Make it Christian again.
it make it Christian again. But and here's where I think Christian nationalist, like that diagnostic category, is helpful. When I read Whitehead and Perry's "Taking America Back for God," um,
Hmm.
what they're talking about is the idea that a lot of people hold that this was, is, or at least should be a Christian nation, which means led by white, conservative Christian men,
Men.
especially, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, totally.
with a rolling back of the gains of power for women, for people of color, and a rolling back of immigration, and even a rolling back of the separation of church and state and religious liberty the way that we have it. So some of the Christian nationalists are really pushing for an explicitly Christian nation in which it's understood that Christianity is the official religion of the United States.
Like
And
Armenia or something like that.
right, that's right, huh? And like that this is a country that belongs to, by right, white Christians. Used to be white Christian Protestants, but white Christians, and that everybody else should be rolled back and put back in their place, so called.
Hmm.
And so it would also involve all kinds of policy changes to roll back cultural liberalization, including rolling back abortion, rolling back gay rights, trans advances, all of that stuff. Um, uh, Even rolling back, some are arguing for rolling back the equality for women in society, right? Um,
Hmm. Yes,
so
yes, they are.
they are, right? So I think the unique thing that Pentecostals kind of brought was the susceptibility to a charismatic leader who reminded them of the charismatic leaders who often lead charismatic and Pentecostal churches.
Hmm.
Authoritarian, uh, bombastic, strong, decisive, masculine, um,
Yeah.
with a
Doesn't care
vision.
what anyone says. They're going to do what they have to do.
Yeah, and so Trump represented that, but Trump also knew how to say to conservative Christians of all types, this country belongs to you, and I will take it back for you. And so,
Yes, I can see that for
right.
sure.
And so, to make sense of how a pretty godless man could be playing that role, the Cyrus image was helpful.
Very
Um,
helpful.
and
Although I would argue Cyrus might have been a much better leader and maybe even a better Christian.
yes, I think so. Cyrus, for example, had a pretty humane immigration policy, didn't he? He let
Yeah, he did.
he
He
let
was
the exiles
very
go home.
He was very cosmopolitan. He was
He
very
was.
nice to the Jews and yeah,
He let them
majorly.
rebuild their temple and so on, as long as they understood who was really in charge, right?
Of course.
Um,
I would say that's Trump.
so, so I think that also this desire to read history in cosmic terms,
Hmm.
to want to either sacralize or demonize people
Hmm.
is, I think, more prevalent on the charismatic Pentecostal side than it is in like your average Southern Baptist church, maybe, you know?
Right. So like the cosmic powers kind of thing that are at
Right.
work against is that kind of thing like this,
Yes.
like the demonic satanic powers and godly powers of good and evil at work in history.
Especially if you then identify that with politicians or parties.
Yes.
So Trump and the Republicans as the force of God and,
Oh, good.
you know, and good, and Biden or Clinton and the Democrats as, you know, pedophilic, child sacrificing demons or whatever, you know.
Then how can they not be evil?
Right. And so then you're in the cosmic dualism struggle between good and evil. And again, the further you go that way in your thinking, it doesn't have to be Pentecostal to get there. The more susceptible I think one is to extremism in well, maybe we have to use violence, or maybe we have to look the other way when other people use violence, because ultimate stakes are involved here, you know?
Right. Ends justify the means.
Yeah,
You can get there
absolutely.
very quickly.
You can get there very quickly. Um and um and once that rhetoric is in the air, I mean, the book of Revelation is a resource always, right? You can always draw on Revelation or the book of Joshua
Yes.
or
Yes.
whatever, and you know, take up arms and win the holy war. And you can rouse a crowd with that stuff too. You know, it's
Yes,
it's
you can.
it's not that far a stretch from, you know, we're in a war that's not against flesh and blood, and may God, you know, I mean, it's not that far from that kind of language
No.
to violence.
Well,
Right.
I mean, it's like what the Spanish, you know, the things behind the motivations behind things like the Spanish Inquisition, and we can look at them and say they're crazy. But again, what I think they were, I would say they're deceived. I would say they were misinformed. I would say they were incorrect. But what were they doing? Right? They thought they were saving a soul from hell.
Right.
You know, like, and I'm not saying all of them thought that. I'm not saying there wasn't power in grab there, right? People that, but I think that like the way they justified it, probably a lot of way some of these priests or whatever thought is they're saving people from hell. So they
Yeah.
have to do this. They have to, the body, it's better for the body to be maimed
Mm.
than for the soul to stay in hell. And it's a bad interpretation that's led to violence. Go ahead. What were you saying?
I was just going to say that there is a pretty disciplined tradition of Christian political thought that has warned against this kind of way of thinking about politics. I mean, for a long time, you know,
Hmm.
like Dietrich Bonhoeffer said
Yeah.
that the realm of social ethics and political is penultimate, and the realm of eternity is ultimate. Or even Augustine talking about the city of God versus the city of earth, the city of
Yes.
man.
Yes.
They're not the same thing. What happens in earthly politics is not ultimate in the way that what happens with, you might say, the eternal condition of a human soul, right? We have to be
Right.
able to draw the distinction and not turn politics into a cosmic battleground. And
Right.
part of what democracy does is to say, we are all citizens of this country. We have different convictions, but we commit. I use the language of covenant because it's part of the tradition. We covenant to live together in community with each other. And part of democratic politics is we will not kill each other if we disagree. We will debate it out, right?
We will figure it out. Right.
We'll figure it out. And whether there's two parties, 3 or 8, or they shift or whatever, we will use nonviolent democratic processes to resolve who will be in power. Free and fair elections. And then we will respect the results of elections and allow the winners to govern under proper checks and balances until it's time for the next elections, and then we'll do it again. And when we're in the minority, we will articulate our views, and we'll lose most of the time, but we'll wait our turn until it's the next time. And we will respect the humanity and patriotism of the people who don't agree with us politically. And we will contest these issues using democratic processes, free and fair debate, etc. It's like these old-fashioned democratic norms have eroded a lot, especially on the right, I would say, and we need to cover them. I talk about the language of covenant, which the Puritans pretty much brought into the birth of modern democracy. The idea that that you might say a political community is kind of like a covenanted community in which we together have a kind of shared equality, shared rights, and shared responsibilities. And we covenant with each other to respect each other and also to respect the democracy that we have carefully built over many centuries.
Yes.
And we don't just take a hacksaw to it and hope for the best. And I think that's part of what's gone wrong, is we're not respecting the norms of the covenant of democracy that have been built up over many centuries. And when you look at the alternative to democracy, you may not like what's happening in this democracy, but try, living under like the Myanmar government or something and see how you like that, right?
Oh, yeah. So let me make sure I understand where we've come to thus far. So the book is essentially looking at the ideals of democracy, giving it a definition,
fleshing that out
on historical research. And what I've heard you say is democracy is about free and fair elections. It's about the idea that when one party wins, they remain in power with checks and balances until the other party gets a chance to come back. It's always done by democratic processes, which by nature involve people voicing what they think, using the tools of democracy like debate, like bringing things out into the marketplace of ideas. That's what democracy is. And then you go into looking about a Christian fundamental reaction in 7 different places, countries. I'm assuming to show this isn't a uniquely American thing, but this is like if it's happening in these kinds of places, that means it's a broader issue.
Right.
And that there's this reaction. And also not only has it taken place widely geographically, but even through time.
Right.
Right. So what does that cause? It's diachronic, right? Through time. So what, and now we are faced here with this resurgence in the first quarter of the 21st century, where we have these very concerning Christian reactions to the liberal kind of more quote unquote worldly influence that has now taken the country and laws and places to areas where the conservative Christian is would not be happy. And not even that, it's evil. Like we're giving in to the cosmic forces of evil.
At least on one wing of this movement, that's the rhetoric. That's right.
And on one wing. And so when I do that, what I make you not a person, but I make you, or you are a person, but you're a person that's been corrupted, possessed.
Right. Yeah.
I had a pastor say, before the 2016 elections, with all the seriousness in the world, and I know that you know this, you've seen it, you know that Hillary Clinton's demon possessed, right?
Wow. Yeah. Well, there it is. That was a really good synopsis. I would say in the democracy chapter, the definition chapter, I talk about democracy as rule of the people through the rule of law.
Yes.
So what went wrong in ancient Greek democracy in Athens was the rule of law was too weak, so that the rule of the people sometimes amounted to what was criticized as essentially the rule of the mob, right? And
Right.
so a functioning democracy is a rule of the people under the rule of law, but the people have come up with the laws that govern how they will live, right?
Right.
And I also have in the first chapter like a long checklist of characteristics of a functioning democracy in terms of political rights and civil liberties, and also democratic norms like freedom of speech and diversity of media and free and fair
Hmm.
elections and um, certain kind of political culture, respect for the rule of law, things like that. So um, that this, I describe democracy as a tradition that has been built up through trial and error over many centuries. Um, no democracy that exists is ever perfect because nothing human beings create is perfect.
Yeah.
But a democracy with the firm rule of law and a functioning democratic norms and separation of powers, civil liberties, human rights protections, limits on the power of the state. Um, it took hundreds of years to develop these traditions to check tyranny and centralized power, right? And Christians took a while to be persuaded that democracy was better because I think we lacked obvious resources for democracy in Scripture because there are no democracies in the Bible.
Yeah.
You know, you have
There's no religious freedom in the
there's
Bible.
no religious freedom in the Bible. You have Jewish theocracy and then the dynastic rule of the kings, but you did have the prophets. You have some
Yeah.
resources there in the nature of the Jewish covenant with God, in the
Absolutely.
prophets, in the nature of Christian community and the witness of Jesus. But we had to learn that however messy a democracy is, it's preferable even to a Christian kingship. Because as soon as you have one good, lovely Christian monarch, the next one is corrupt as can
And
be,
horrible.
horrible, and you can't do
And
anything
they have
about
all
it
the power.
because they have all the power, right? So we learned over time that no matter how lovely King A is, we do better with a democratic system under the solid rule of law. But then what happened is democracy, because it reflects the will of the people, it's going to reflect the values of the people.
Yes.
So if the values of the people evolve, then the laws will evolve.
Yes, they will.
And if the values of the people move away from, let's call it traditional Christian values, then the laws will evolve as well. But I think that from the 1960s forward, many conservative Christians felt that the evolution of the values of their neighbors and therefore of the laws of the country had become intolerable.
Yeah.
And I want to say that I understand this view, and I know a lot of people who have this view, and in some ways I share it.
Yeah, I would actually say the exact same thing.
In some ways I share it. Like for example, um, the erosion of solid and stable families is not a great thing. It's not good for
No,
people.
it's very, very concerning.
Right. Um, or what about this? The erosion of stable romantic relationship among adults is not really good for children, nor is it very good for adults.
No,
Right. Or
I
how about
agree.
this? I think the weakening of character in America, combine that with drugs, combine
Hmm.
that with guns, and
It's not a good mix.
we have a lot of not very healthy people killing each other with guns. Okay?
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot that's wrong with our culture.
Sure.
But I don't think the answer is to set aside democracy and come up with some kind of Christian authoritarian state under,
Right.
like, who's going to decide who's going to lead that state? Is that going to be Donald Trump? Is that going to be, we just bring Viktor Orban and have him rule us the way he rules Hungary, right?
Hmm.
So,
No, we don't want that.
so we need cultural renewal, but we also need democratic renewal. But what
Hmm.
I think has happened is the whipped up hysteria about cultural changes people's fear that they're losing their own children,
Yes.
or will lose them to the liberals or the gays or whatever. Um, uh, and the feeling that the democracy is not delivering the results that they want, all of that, and plus Trump whipping up undemocratic sentiments after the November 2020 election,
Oh
all
my
of
word.
that here led to the most dangerous risk to our peaceful transfer of power and respect for election results that I've seen in my lifetime.
Yes.
And
Me too.
that's happened in other countries too.
We
Um,
had a guy. Oh, go
yeah.
ahead, sorry. We had a
Yes.
guy that came on here that we interviewed that did a course for one trim. They were used to be the great courses. I don't know if you've heard of them, but I love them. They have so many great resources
Oh
and
yeah, the great courses. Yeah.
yeah, the great courses. And
I've
so
listened to a lot of those. Yeah.
I love them. So he has one on democracy and its alternatives. And his whole thing is democracy is declining across the world, and he's trying to figure out why. And he's trying to understand what's happening here. We have these strong men that are being put up, and like similar to what you said. It's interesting because I feel like you guys would have a lot to talk about.
Who
And
was that?
I got to remember his name. I'll send you an email
Okay.
with the information on it. But I interviewed him. Great guy. Awesome interview. But the idea that we're in this place where people are, where people like this assumed, like it was assumed democracy was forever. I mean, when I grew up, that's what
Right.
I was taught. It was assumed that it's untouchable. And yet now it's like it feels like it's just yeah, like not crumbling. I wouldn't use that kind of language. I know some people would, but disintegrating,
You know,
weakening.
there's two words I've seen in this political science literature that are technical, but they're helpful. One of them is called democratic backsliding,
Yes.
and you
I really like that.
that's a good religious term, right?
That is a great
Backsliding, right?
religious term.
um,
Bunch of
uh,
backsliders.
and another is democratic deconsolidation. So what you're saying is when you said democracy seemed untouchable, another way to say it is democracy seemed like it had consolidated like a real solid, block of concrete. Nothing can break
Yeah,
it
you
up.
can't break it.
It's been there forever. It's just permanent. But study of history shows that nothing that humans build cannot be broken by humans.
Yes.
And that's what
That
was
is
so scary.
really well put.
If you have a historical perspective and you think we're talking about an institution in the U.S. Constitution that has been around since say 1789, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or 1776 and 1789, we actually watched it at risk on January 6th.
Yeah, we did.
If those guys had gone in there and like they had killed the vice president and speaker of the House, or if Trump had actually marched on the Capitol and Pence and Nancy Pelosi had been captured or killed, where would we have been on January 7th?
I don't know.
Right? So, so democratic deconsolidation, democratic backsliding is a possibility for any democracy.
Yes.
But it's
I
not just leaders, it's also people getting seduced away from valuing democracy because they're not happy with the results for a while.
They're not happy with the results. And that's what you're hitting on because I mean, and that is so crucial. So let me run through a scenario with you and I'd love for you to respond.
Okay.
Because these are things that I hear from people, not just people online, friends, people I love, people I respect, right? These are not people that I think are dumb. They're not people I think are irrational, right? So
Right.
they're people that I respect. I think they can be misinformed, but they're people that I respect. So something like this, and I've heard this from several different places, several different people. The election, I look at the data of the election and it's clear that it was stolen. There's too many discrepancies and whatever. Now, we don't have to get into all that evidence, right? Because I'm just making this up.
Right.
Like, I don't know the exact thing, but something like this. It was stolen. The media, you can't trust anything the media says.
Right.
Haven't you seen that Joe Rogan video where every single person, I don't know if you actually have seen this, but they have this clip where there's like 20 different like newscasters, and they're saying the exact same thing from like all over the country. Like, this basically this script that was fed them almost. And so so hey, have you seen that? Have you seen the way? I mean, how can we trust this government? Like, what if there's pedophiles? I mean, haven't you seen Jeffrey Epstein? Haven't you seen the people that have, ridden on that? They have the captain's log or whatever, and they have the people that are there, and all these politicians row with Jeffrey Epstein. We're on his island. Clear there's pedophilia going on there, all this stuff. So why is it really that much to think that there couldn't be this ring? And, we obviously, there's been evil governments. We've had, Bonhoeffer fought against Nazism, right? You have people, don't you wish the church could have risen up during, the Russian Revolution with the millions of people that were starved through collectivization and stuff like that. So all my point is, right, they're going to say these things, which are like, hey, yeah, I understand that maybe we don't want a Christian government, but do we want an atheist government? Do we want a Muslim government? Do we want a, secular? That's a religion in of itself. Where do we go? How do we bring this conversation to a place where people that feel like that, and people that feel like January 6th was the most patriotic act those people could have done to save our country, and those people that think that was absolute insurrection and are scared to death because these Christians, there are a lot of Christians, there are a lot of people that voted for Trump. What's going on? I was one of them in 2016, right? And I was afraid, and I was glad, and I'll be honest with you, there's a part of me that is that is very glad we have this really conservative court, because I feel like, oh man, I can rest a little easier. Now, I'm not saying that's the part of me that I like. I'm not saying that's the part of me that I'm proud of, or that's the part of me that I don't want to subjugate people. I don't want my brother-in-law who's married to a man to have to live in hiding and not have rights and not have, I don't, but there's this part of me that's like, ooh, I hope that they reverse that Obergefell. I hope they do all that. Why it wasn't a good decision anyway. What I'm trying to bring out is like, this is how people are thinking.
Right.
Like me, and people not like me, but have overlapping agreement with me. Right. So I know that that's not a question in there. It's more of like responding to these.
Yeah.
How do we get to a place where you and we're having a good conversation, but how do we get to a place where we can challenge each other and listen to each other?
Yeah.
And find some kind of agreement, some kind of compromise.
I think that part of what you brought out that's the most challenging is there's difference of opinions, and then there's differences of facts. The election was stolen.
Yeah, let's get into that. That's really
if you
good.
do that, the fact that all election challenges were set aside by the courts on the basis of facts and law, does that not matter at all? I mean, it
matters to me,
right? That the specific accusations of specific misconduct were examined and were shredded one after another. So after a while, sometimes people leave the realm of reality and move into a realm of fantasy. In part, I think, because the will to believe is very strong in human beings.
I mean, we're belief machines.
We are belief machines. And so I can see it this way. A group of the population saying, I cannot believe that the American people would choose Joe Biden over Donald Trump. Therefore, the American people did not choose Joe Biden over Donald Trump. It's a lie, right?
Right. That's dangerous thinking.
It is dangerous thinking, and because it could go the other way too. Um, I could not believe the American people chose Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. Therefore, it was the Russians who gave us Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So,
And if Hillary had tried to make some big deal, we would have
yes,
lost it.
right. I use the example in the book. Remember the 2000 election, Bush versus
Yeah.
Gore?
Yeah.
537 votes in Florida.
537.
If Al Gore had acted in 2000 the way that Donald Trump acted in 2020, where would we have been, right? Um, so, so when people are untethered from reality because of the will to believe, partly related to the demonization of the other side, it's really hard to have a conversation. But there's some part of it that I want to pick up on related to the court. I do think that one thing that's in an odd way working in our democracy is that the power is diffused. We have three branches of government, and we have a federalist system.
It was designed for this moment.
It was designed for this. So if the Supreme Court happens to be ultra conservative, then some people who might be tempted to insurrection, tempted to despair of American democracy, can say, well, the system worked well enough that we have control of the Supreme Court, and so all is not lost, right?
Right.
Or they can look at 20 states and say, well, we may not like what's happening in Massachusetts, but Texas sure looks good, right?
We can go to Texas.
We can go to Texas. Or, well, right now the Republicans have Congress, they have the House, and so we're getting some things we want there. That while liberals or Democrats may not like what's happening in those places, it is, I think, somewhat reassuring. And in the book, I quote a couple of people who, for example, after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, there were some people who said, we had thought that more radical means might be necessary, but we can see that American democracy is still working. And so actually from that, the threat from the right, having a conservative court is actually maybe a tonic. You know, it keeps some people from going all the way around the bend, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean Democrats and liberals are happy with the results of these court decisions. But if you're thinking systemically, if we want in the year 2100 to have a democracy in which elections are respected and all the things we've said, right? Then people have to learn to bear with political results that they don't like.
Yeah.
Year after year, decade after decade.
And trust.
And
trust the process.
Trust the process.
They don't.
Yeah, and they don't. A lot of people don't. Too many people don't.
A lot of people don't, yes.
I think that we should be feeling pretty glad for the diversity of our politics, state by state and branch by branch.
Yes.
With the judiciary sometimes saying yes to the Democrats, sometimes saying yes to the Republicans, with decisions going this way and that way. The rule of law understood to be an independent thing that is not purely political. All of that helps to keep the democracy alive. Probably the worst thing that could happen would be for either side to get their fever dream of total power in every state, in every branch of government, because then the other side would really, given how much people hate each other, they'd really be inflamed, and our democracy might really be even more at risk than it is now.
Man, so so this is random, but I thought about it while we're on the topic of the Supreme Court and trusting the process. Expanding the Supreme Court. I just got a good idea, bad idea, neutral idea.
I mean, I think in terms of the Constitution, there's nothing unconstitutional about it.
Right.
But it's a tradition that goes back a long way. And I think I side with Biden's tendency here to say, no, we're not going to do that. Instead, if the Republicans keep being extreme, we'll keep winning elections, and eventually, Democrats will be naming Supreme Court judges in the balance.
Yeah, for sure.
I
mean, the reality is, it just struck that Trump got to have an unprecedented almost amount of appointments during one presidency.
Yeah, it's true. And the Republicans, I mean, McConnell manipulated that process in a way that I think
Oh yeah,
was not in keeping with democratic norms. That, the thing about that is, here's democratic norm. If there's a vacancy, the party in power puts forward a name,
right,
and whoever's in control of the Senate holds hearings.
right.
And if that norm breaks down, if we have divided government, we could have a Supreme Court of like 110-year-olds, or we could have 6 people on it, or 3, because we can't get appointments, right?
Right.
I mean, one possible argument for expanding the court would be if we end up in such deadlock that nominees are not even voted on for long periods of time, we might need to have some extra judges.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about that,
Yeah.
but far better to respect the norm.
Of democratic processes.
All the people who write about democracy say it's not just about the Constitution and the laws, it's also about norms. Norms, customs, traditions. One custom is that when a Democratic president or a Republican president has a Congress controlled by the other side, their nominees are still processed. McConnell wouldn't even give Merrick Garland a hearing. And that's a violation of the democratic tradition. And every one of those violations kind of does further damage to the norms that help keep a democracy alive.
So where have you seen this in the Democratic side? You mentioned a few Republican, and you had mentioned before that you felt like the right was less. What did you say? They were more essentially that they were less able to stay connected to reality in terms of like giving people, like giving everyone a voice. And I mean, I'm not saying it right, but you were referring to the right being less
a little bit
just
weaker,
being less open to debate. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So what you've seen this in the right, and I agree. I mean, and I think people on the right do need to hear, like, hey guys, like your people in power manipulating this process. And yeah, I know that you want these people in power because you feel like they represent you, which they may not even, but they are, like you said, like you can't just do whatever you want. That's not how our government has been established. So, but what kind of things have you seen on the Democratic side, or have you seen the same kinds of things that would concern you?
Well, I would say if I were to have written a different book or a bigger book, I could have talked about authoritarian governments from the left. In Latin America, for example, that has been a fairly common phenomenon, authoritarian governments of the left. The ultimate authoritarian governments of the left were the communist governments, of course.
Right.
So authoritarianism is not a phenomenon only of the right. Demonization of the other side is a human problem. It's not just a right-wing problem.
Sure, yeah.
Right. Getting frustrated with the results of the democratic process and looking to manipulate the process and violate norms in doing so, anybody can do that. I think of Franklin Roosevelt's court packing scheme in the late 1930s, right?
Right.
He wasn't happy with what that court was saying, and so he decided to try to mess with it, and was slapped down, right?
Yes.
So anybody can be frustrated with democracy. Anybody can fall prey to authoritarianism. Anybody can demonize the other side. Anybody can lose contact with reality. I mean, after a while, like conspiracy thinking and stuff can happen from the extreme left and the extreme right.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
The extreme anti-vaxxers, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he's running on the Democratic side, right?
I know.
That involves erosion of confidence in mainstream institutions of all types, right? You don't trust medicine, you don't trust the media, So
all the big things, media, medicine, education, government.
Right.
You can't trust any of it.
You can't trust any of them, then you're going to end up in la la land with various kinds of conspiracy theories and things on the fringes. So I do want to say that that human beings on any political persuasion are capable of going in any of these directions. But still, the thesis of my book is that Christian reactionary and authoritarian politics is almost always on the right.
Well, yeah, that makes sense.
It's not Christian because of conservative moral values believed to be threatened by modern cultural liberalization, but also a longer tendency of being more comfortable with centralized power. The good Christian monarch, the good Christian pastor, the good Christian bishop or pope, the good Christian emperor. So because we picture God as the ultimate, you might say, the one centralized authority is God. That may be one reason why we've had a tendency to be okay contemplating little demigods who have centralized power.
I think so.
Modern liberal democratic egalitarianism is a little bit less susceptible to that, I think. But now, while my book is mainly about authoritarian trends on the Christian right, I hope that the book exudes a kind of a sympathy for what it is that's motivating people, and an awareness that this is a human problem, not just a Republican or conservative problem, you know?
Right. And because you are a Christian ethicist, and so you bring yourself into the camp of Christians.
Right.
And so you're looking at your own,
right.
It's not your tradition necessarily, but in some ways it is, right? I mean, it's your tribe, so to speak.
These are my people. Yeah.
For lack of a better term.
Yep.
And so now that you have that, you're trying to speak to what you know and to what you have.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I can't hear you for some reason. I don't know if something happened.
I kind of need to wrap up anyway, so maybe we should leave it
I don't know
here.
if something happened on my end. Let's see here. This happened to me last time, so that's what I'm wondering about. Okay. Okay, sorry. It was me.
Okay. I kind of need to go anyway. Maybe we're at a good stopping point here.
Sorry. Oh my god. It's this thing goes to Siri on my, I put a marker. It goes to Siri on my computer, and then I can't hear anything when it does that. Anyway, sorry.
So can you not hear me right now?
I can. You're good to go. I apologize.
Yeah, I was saying maybe we should stop here because I told somebody else I would be with them at 12.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah, but
yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
I think we reached a good stopping point. I think that was a really rich conversation. If you want, I'll send you this manuscript, and if you want to say, okay, now I've dived into your manuscript, and we can do part 2, right?
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, let's do part 1 and then part 2. So let me just end this real quick so you can jump off.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for being with us, David. So great to hear you talk about your book. How can people follow you and keep up with what's going on? We'll probably do a part 2 of this to get into more. There's so much to talk about, but how can they keep following you?
Yes, I have a website, davidpgushee.com, and that's a good place to go. I'm on social media at dpgushee. I have a Substack under that as well. So that would be it. And all my books are on Amazon.
Yes, and we recommend you guys to make this happen and go and check out his stuff and buy it and support. So thank you so much. And guys, it's been great to have you on here. It's been great to let you guys join us to listen in on this conversation. We're looking forward to seeing you next time.